Thanks for everyone joining us today for the website accessibility workshop.
All right, I'm Jess Brown. I'm a lead front-end developer at Adage Technologies. I've been at Adage for a little over 4 years, and I work on a team that builds websites, and we're currently building a few at the moment. We've released a whole bunch, deployed a whole bunch last year, so I'm very well versed in accessibility. I've been studying it for the last several years, so I'm really excited to share a lot of these tips with you guys.
All right, my turn. Hi, my name is Ruijie Liu. I'm a lead user experience designer here at Adage Technologies, and I've been with Adage for almost 7 years now. And from a UX perspective, I'm helping clients with leading workshops and trying to understand the user need and pain points. I also lead the design effort, doing prototypes and design. And that's when I really collaborate a lot with Jess and our development team to ensure our design solutions are accessible, which is a really the topic that I'm very excited to share some hands-on tips with you guys today. So yeah, stay tuned. A lot to come in today's workshop.
All right, so let's start with the basics. What is web accessibility? Sorry, my cats are making sounds. First, some key terminology. These are acronyms that you might see anywhere in the context of web accessibility. First is the ADA. This is the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, and it is the legal backbone of accessibility arguments in the United States. And the act prohibits discrimination based on disability in any context, including the web. And contrary to the way some people use it, the ADA is not interchangeable with the term accessibility. The ADA is only applicable in legal contexts and only in the US. Next is WCAG. This is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. It's usually pronounced WCAG, so we're going to be saying WCAG today. And this is the standard used to test whether web content meets requirements for accessibility. And the WCAG is constantly being revised to reflect current technologies, and it's currently on version 2.1. And it's used as the accessibility standard in many countries, not just the US. There are 3 levels of compliance for most of the rules. A single A is the bare minimum, double A is the recommended level of compliance, and triple A is the most complex requirements. And you might say that something is WCAG AA compliant to describe a site that has reached AA standard for most of the guidelines. And then AT, this is a little less common to hear, but this is the acronym for assistive technology. And it's a blanket term for technology and tools that people can use to aid computer and internet access. And this includes input devices like keyboards, output devices like braille displays, and assistive software like screen readers. So it can be easy to underestimate the sheer number of users that are impacted by web accessibility and the scale of the problem that they face on the web. So according to the CDC, about 1 in 4 adults has some type of disability, and specifically disabilities that affect vision, motor skills, and cognitive function can fundamentally change the way you use the web. And in a WebAIM survey with automated testing tools, they found that 98.1% of the top 1 million websites had detectable WCAG guideline failures on their homepage. And there was an average of 60.9 errors per page. So the other 1.9% of the websites here, they may have also had issues, but none of them could be detected by an automated test.
All right, thank you for sharing all this stat. And as Jess mentioned, really it affects a lot of people. And when we look at disability and accessibility, we also should be looking at it across a spectrum of different states. One way to look at disability and why we want to make things accessible for people with disability is that disability really is a mismatched human interactions. And that was pointed out in the Microsoft Inclusive Design guideline. So the mismatches span across a whole spectrum from permanent, temporary to situational. And in this example, someone may has one arm, and that's a permanent situation, and someone may have an arm injury, and that's a temporary disability situation. And then in the third scenario, a mother with a newborn baby, that's a situational, because in that specific situation, she may only have one arm free to interact with devices and interfaces. So as we see here, and these disability states and spectrums really span across all the different categories of disability. So when we think about making things accessible, there are really a lot of people that are being affected by the accessibility effort. So that's kind of answer this question, right? Who is benefited by accessibility efforts? A solution that benefits someone in a permanent state, like we looked at earlier, will also benefit those who suffer temporary disability or situational disability. So being mindful of the whole spectrum will really help us better scale the impact of our design solutions. And another stat, in the United States, 26,000 people a year suffer from loss of upper extremities. But when we include people with temporary and situational impairments, like we saw in the previous slide, the number becomes greater than 20 million. And that just further proves that making our solutions accessible really can make a bigger impact than we might have thought initially. With the COVID situation, and there's also some unique stats and reports coming out saying that now that even when people recover, sometimes there's symptoms like brain fog and fatigue. Those are really commonly reported. So making our sites and interface accessible is really important, considering that an inaccessible experience would make their life harder.
So next we'll talk about something called the curb cut effect. On this slide, there's an image of a person in a wheelchair approaching a steep curve or a steep curb, and below it is an example of a curb cut or dip where the curb meets street level. So the first curb cuts in the United States were introduced in Michigan in 1945 to help disabled veterans navigate street crossings. However, curb cuts also aid people with strollers, luggage, bicycles, or any other number of scenarios. And the development of curb cuts inspired what we call the curb cut effect, which is when a feature designed for disabled people ends up helping everyone.
Time for a poll.
So yeah, so now we have a poll, and just to just do a quick poll between all of the attendees here. Do you have subtitles on when watching movies and TV shows on Netflix?
Give a couple minutes. But it's holding steady at 70, more, 70-30, but I'm going to go ahead and close it up here in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Right, so subtitles, perfect example of the curb cut effect. Subtitles and closed captioning were originally meant for people who are deaf or hard of hearing, and it's a feature that a whole lot of people use for any given reason. All right.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that point, as me personally, I always have subtitles on. And I remember when I first came to the US and went to the movie theater and there's no subtitles, and I had a really hard time following up with the dialogue because of they're speaking in a fashion that's specific to that period, and it's a little bit challenging. So I only got half. I had to read Wikipedia afterwards to understand what the movie was all about. So, so I certainly personally appreciate all the subtitles when it's available.
All right. So next up, we're going to get into the hands-on activities here. So just as an organizing idea here, so the WCAG guidelines are developed, published, and maintained by the World Wide Web Consortium, or the W3C, and the guidelines are organized into 4 distinct categories that we refer to with the acronym POUR, or POUR. So P is perceivable. The guidelines in this category are to ensure that information and user interface components can be presented to users in ways that they can perceive, depending on what senses they have available or how they're interacting with the site. O is operable. User interface components and navigation must be operable by all users. U is understandable. So information and the operation of the user interface must be understandable to all users. And R is robust. So content must be robust enough that it can be interpreted by a wide variety of user agents, including assistive technologies. All right, so for this webinar, we'll be covering 4 of the most common and harmful accessibility issues that show up on the web. So we'll show you examples of successes and failures and help you check your own website against the standard.
So yeah, this is the first one that we'll be looking at, is the low contrast. And before we dive into the first one, just want to do a quick rundown of the steps that we'll be going through. So for each of these hands-on section, we'll be just quickly introduce what each common issue is and how things might be affected, and then we will show you a quick demo and then give you some time to try it out yourself, and then we will wrap up and move on to the next. So the first we'll be covering is low contrast. 86.3% of the top 1 million homepages had at least one detectable contrast failure in the most recent WebAIM survey.
And we're going to reference that WebAIM survey a lot. WebAIM is a very prominent name in accessibility, and they do a yearly survey of like the state of accessibility on the web. So they have a lot of great data. So next is alternative text for images. So in the same survey, 66% of home pages had images with missing alt text. And over half of these failures were also links, which is a second different failure. And it's also common for images to have incorrect or inappropriate alt text.
And then next, there's the confusing digital forms. Form inputs without labels and confusing error messages can be a blocker to users. Issues with forms can be especially frustrating to encounter and make users walk away.
And last, we'll cover inaccessibility to keyboard users. So keyboard accessibility is reliant on good contrast, focus, markup, and robust functionality. And because of that, I like to think of keyboard accessibility as like a canary in the coal mine. Keyboard functionality is quick and easy to test, and any problems encountered can be evidence of far worse issues below the surface. All right, so as we get into these demos, we'll show you how to run tests on your own website. So in Chrome or Firefox, pull up your home page. And in a separate tab, pull up a page that includes a number of images. And if your home page includes images, you can just stick with the home page. And then in another tab, pull up a page that includes some kind of form, like a contact form or a newsletter sign up if you have one. And if you haven't already, please make sure that you have the Wave extension downloaded and installed in the browser you're using. And let us know if you need any help with this setup.
Just in case there are a few of you that couldn't access or couldn't find the chat tab in the GoToWebinar panel, I also just put all of these prep steps here in the questions. So I sent a question to the to the entire audience as well.
So,
All right.
Yeah, we'll dive into the hands-on portion of this workshop. The first one, as we introduced earlier, we'll be looking at text contrast and the number 1.4.3 that correlates to the numbering that it was mentioned in the WCAG guidelines. So just for easy reference, in case you want to dig a little bit deeper after this workshop to learn the more specifics. So this guideline falls under the perceivable category. It's pretty straightforward. We want to provide enough contrast between the text and its background, so people with moderate low vision can read it. And this covers all text that conveys information. Decorative text, for example, some random words that you use as a background on your website, those are excluded from this. But note that if you use an image of a text, but the image of text is also used to convey any sort of information, then that is covered under this guideline. Although another best practices just want to mention here that we should really avoid using images of text. That is against the best practices. The requirement for the AA standard is a contrast ratio of 4.5 to 1. And for larger text, the requirement is slightly lower at 3 to 1. 86.3% of home pages have at least one contrast failure, and that's according to the report that just it came out at February 2020. And this can really be frustrating to users with low vision or cognitive disabilities. And not only people with low vision benefit from a clear text, it also benefits people who have a color vision deficit, because the contrast ratio is calculated in a way that color is not a key factor. And if we recall the states of disability that we walked through earlier in this workshop, having a good contrast will really also benefit people in the temporary.
Do we lose
Their
you?
screens might be dimmed, or
Repeat
where
that
there's
last
a strong glare.
Regio.
This tool to check contrast. Oh, am I back? Am I having? I think I got a notification saying I have some audio issue.
Okay.
Am I back?
Yeah, you
Yeah,
are
you are.
just after temporary.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, hopefully it doesn't happen again. Apologize for the inconvenience. So yeah, temporary. For example, like in the situation where their screens might be dimmed, or there's a strong glare that makes it harder for them to read what's being displayed. And we will be using Wave, which is really a great tool to check contrast. It's really easy to use, and if you follow the instruction that we shared earlier, you should have that in your browser extension list. And we're going to show a quick recording and then give you some time to practice on your own to use the Wave tool. And for this specific exercise, we'll inspect a home page with the tool and note if there's any text contrast error. And the example that we went through is here on the New York Times. So I'm just going to play this. As you can see here, maybe I can zoom a little bit so it's easier to see. So we'll be looking at mostly this, notice this gray author name, and that's where a lot of the, where we think it might be a low contrast. And then we ran the tool. As you can see here, as we started using Wave, it started listing out all the errors. And of course, that one is pointed out as a very low contrast. And as we see here,
the connection is a little slow, so I'm not sure if it's playing at the same speed as you're seeing it.
Sorry, yeah.
That's all right. You
Maybe
wanna,
I'll turn off my webcam, just make
Yeah.
sure maybe it's might be a little bit easier.
perfect.
So it should end at this very low contrast and then have the wave panel open on the side, and you can see it's telling you what the color is, the text versus the color in the background, and then the contrast ratio. It is 2.68 to 1, which is lower than the required 4.5 to 1, and even lower than the required for the larger text. So in this case, this is clearly a failure to meet the guidelines requirements, the AA standard. So news, so just, this is the news website, and interestingly, from the WebM report, there's this fact that news, weather, and information websites have 84.5% more errors than average. They were actually among the lowest ranked in the WebM survey accessibility site.
Let me know when you're ready for a question.
So now it's the hands-on portion for you to try it out, to inspect this on your homepage or the page that you would like to check the contrast. Go to your homepage or the page that you like to check and click the wave extension. And I have a little screenshot here of it should look something like that with that wave and W logo in your extension panel. And then when you click that, that should just run on the page, and you should be able to see all the errors it's reporting back, and check the specific, click on the specifics to check the details. So we will give you guys a few minutes to try on this tool on your own, and then we'll see what results we get.
Great. While that's happening, I'll ask a question that we have from an attendee. Is white text on a black background okay for contrast?
Yes, that would be a pretty high contrast ratio. So the contrast ratio just takes into account comparing the two colors against each other. So that's how this standard works. However, I'm sure you've seen certain situations where like white text on a black background is not readable. Just because if the lines are too thin, or sometimes just in certain situations it can make things a little more difficult. So the guideline here, the contrast ratio number, is just kind of the absolute standard for whether something passes or fails. But with web accessibility, there's a whole lot of gray area where something can pass but also still be inaccessible in reality. So a lot of it is kind of subjective, of like it could pass, but if you still find it unreadable, then you may want to revise it anyway.
Yeah, and then just to add to that, if you use the contrast checker, as long as the same darkness of the black and the white, if you just reverse it, it's the exact same contrast ratio. So to Jeff's point, it will pass from the technical standpoint, but then from a usability standpoint, there's a lot of best practices and research about what's the best use case for that dark mode versus the light mode. So there's certainly a lot more from a usability standpoint to consider on that.
Okay, thanks. I have a comment as well. Give me a minute here. So from an attendee, some of the contrast issues being reported by Wave aren't factoring in any CSS style image overlays. Anything you want to talk about there?
Yeah, I mean, Wave does have limitations for sure. It's not going to be able to take into account the like computed background color sometimes. So especially if there's an image in the background, what you should really do is take a screenshot and kind of pull that into another tool that can test contrast with images. But that's definitely, yeah, if you have an image and then you have some filtering or something, then that can definitely make it a little more complicated to test that.
Yeah,
Okay, great.
And then one
Go ahead,
tool,
and then I have-
one tool to check that is called color contrast analyzer. That's also another plugin to Chrome, and that will really help check that. So there's a lot of plugins, and we have more resources that we will be sharing towards the end of this webinar, and we can also follow up on more information if you have questions after we've gone through the whole hands-on portion.
Yeah, I would say
so hopefully you guys. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I'll say Wave also. I'm sure you saw when you opened up Wave that you saw a lot of other flags besides text contrast. So Wave is a pretty powerful tool, but it is automated, so it's not going to catch every accessibility issue, but it is going to kind of give you a list of things to take a closer look at.
Okay, great. I have another question for you. What are ARIA labels? And
ARIA
when
labels,
should they be
yeah.
used?
Oh, sorry, I have a siren.
You're good. Yeah, yep, go ahead. And when should they be used?
Yeah, so ARIA labels, that's a much larger topic than we're going to have time to really get to today. That's, you know, when to use ARIA labels, when not to use ARIA labels. That's a whole kind of 3-hour webinar on itself. I will say the best ARIA is no ARIA. I don't know if you've heard that before, but ARIA labels are really sort of a bit of they're a way to make the functionality match what it should be to a screen reader user, for example. So if you are using proper HTML, if you're using semantic HTML, then for the most part, you shouldn't need any ARIA labels. ARIA labels really come into account when you're doing complex things that are not by default supported with standard HTML, or if you have to kind of bend elements to do what you need them to do. So yeah, that's a very developer heavy topic, and that's probably a little deeper than we're going to have time to get into today.
Okay, great, thanks.
All right. So did we find any text contrast errors on your homepage? We will be doing a poll for this one, but just I'll be just curious to see. I think we have a lot of questions coming in. It sounds like we're all digging into that tool. And as Jess mentioned, it's certainly not one tool to catch them all, but it is a handy little extension to at least get started on the text contrasting. So we'll be moving on to the next one. Jess?
All right, so next we're going to get into WCAG 2.1 Rule 1.1.1, which is non-text content must have a text alternative. So non-text content encompasses images, videos, and audio, but for this example, we'll strictly be focusing on alt text for images. All right, so here we're showing an image of the Jefferson Memorial in DC. An example of decent alt text for this image would be branches of cherry blossoms with the Jefferson Memorial in the background. In HTML, the image element has an attribute alt for alternative text. And when this is used, it benefits assistive technology users who may not be able to see the images and users with slow connections that fail to load images. And some tips for using alt text. Number one, don't say image of blah, blah, blah. Screen readers will announce graphic before reading the alt text, so this is redundant. And be concise and include information you see at a glance. End it with a period. And if the image is inside a link, describe where the link goes instead of what the image depicts. Screen readers will announce clickable link before reading the alt text, so If it just describes the image, then the user doesn't know what will happen when they click it. All right, so a description of this exercise. For this exercise, we'll inspect an image's alt text and determine if it's missing, inaccurate, or acceptable. And so we have a couple of videos here. So this example is from the University of Washington's website, and academic sites are generally pretty accessible, and this site is quite good. So I'll show you here how to pull up the alt text for an image on your site. Find an image, right-click on it, and inspect. So a DevTools panel will pop up with the HTML code visible. Try and find the IMG tag, the image tag, and an image tag should have an attribute alt. And this attribute should have a value that's similar to the image description that you would assign the image. And this image's alt text description: a teacher in a classroom of students. It's short, it's accurate, and it would be a suitable alternative to users who can't see the image. So if on the same page as that example, there's also an example of how not to write alt text. So for this image of cherry blossoms here, the alt text is cherry blossoms 375x240. And this is going to read as nonsense to anyone who can't see the image. So if we take a stab at rewriting the alt text for this image, we can try something like person standing on a path between two cherry blossom trees. And I'm just changing the text in DevTools here. It's not being saved anywhere, and it will disappear as soon as I close the browser. But editing in DevTools is an easy way to get familiar with HTML. So now it's time for you to do this on your own site. So on your own website, find an image to review, and ideally an image lower on the page, not a hero or a header image. And imagine how you would describe this image to someone who can't see it. And don't overthink it, just explain what the image shows. Then right-click on the image, click Inspect, and try to find the image tag in the HTML code and see if you can locate the alt attribute. And if you can find it, review the alt text. And if you can't find an image tag, if you find something else, we'll cover that in the next slide too, but I'll give you a minute to find the image tag. I see there's a question: what would be a good alt tag for an image that has a picture of an artist playing a guitar and also their name is in the image? So if there's any text in the image, that should absolutely be in the alt text. 100% that should be in there. Because otherwise there's no way for a screen reader user to know that there is text in the image or what it says. Also, alt text suitability really depends on context. So if there wasn't the name of the artist in the image, it depends. Like if the image of a guitar player is used kind of as a generic illustration for a music school or something, then maybe, you know, man playing guitar would be enough. But if it's say on a page about a specific artist, you may want to specify this is so and so playing guitar at this event. You may want to go into more detail, kind of depending on the context, whether it's relevant who that person is. Yeah, I see someone mentioned, could you mention that alt text also helps with SEO too? It absolutely does, yes. A lot of accessibility improvements also help with SEO. It's just kind of a side bonus.
And then do you want to address this last one about what if you have an entire panel of headshots with their names?
Yeah, so if you have,
and then I have two more after that, so just go ahead.
Great. So if you have an entire panel of headshots with their names underneath in text, there is something to be said for you want to avoid being redundant. So if you would literally just say the same person's name again in the alt text, then you can probably leave the alt text blank because that person's name is just repeated below in text. So you don't want a screen reader user to encounter graphic John Smith. You know, that could get a little redundant, especially in a long list. But it's all very situational. The alt text could also probably be headshot, and then there's various ARIA labeling techniques that you could do to associate the image with the name, but that might be kind of overthinking it a little bit. But it depends on what it is. There's a lot of ways to do a lot of these things.
All right, great. I have a question. What about leaving the alt text blank if the image isn't really helpful for someone who's visually impaired?
Yeah, we'll get to that. So if we look at this next slide, so this is just, I'm going over some of the other code patterns that you might see. So if you can't find an image tag on your site, that's okay. It might be a background image, which has a completely different setup. And sometimes these could be associated with an ARIA label, with what would be the alt text assigned as an ARIA label to something with the role image. And that's because there might be a technical reason that someone can't use an image tag and has to use a background image instead. But adding that ARIA label is going to bridge the divide. So that's still going to give a screen reader user that accessible text, even though we can't use an image in that scenario. So another thing you might encounter, if you found the image tag but there is no alt attribute, this is a fail because screen readers will try and read the file name. So they will try, in this example, they would try and read graphic https://image.jpg. You probably don't want that. So in this scenario, if the alt attribute is blank, that means that the image will be invisible to screen reader users. This is something that is useful at times, like I was saying, with redundancy, or if it's just sort of a decorational image, if it's just an icon, but there is text nearby that would describe it, then you may just want to leave alt text blank. So in this case, the screen reader would just pass over it. And then another example, if it has alt text but the value is irrelevant, like image, then it's not helpful and it's not equivalent to seeing the image visually. So did everyone have a chance to inspect their site? If you were able to find an image, did it have alt text? And was the alt text an accurate, concise description of the image? And most importantly, if you were a blind user, would you be able to understand the page or be frustrated by missing or inappropriate alt text?
Great, I have a question for you, Jess. We've noticed recently that hero images with text overlay do not incorporate or allow us to add alt text.
Yeah, I mean that's something to discuss with your developers. There's any number of ways that they may have built it to allow for alt text. It also may have been forgotten. That's why we're covering this today, because if you find gaps, then you can try and get them resolved. But for instance, the way that we often build websites in EpiServer, we can add alt text directly to the image in the media folder. So that alt text property wouldn't show up in your hero block, it would show up on the image itself, the image in the media folder itself. But it really depends. Like, there's a huge variety of ways to cover these things, so it really just depends on what the developers did when they were setting it up.
Okay, and then lastly for this section, I think you mostly answered already. For page banner images, do you have to have an alt text?
Yeah, so that's one of the things I was covering, where there may have been a technical reason to use a background image instead of an image tag. Hero images are especially going to be, it's going to be likely that someone had to use a background image for that, just because of the way that hero images tend to need to cover the page, and there's, the CSS is simpler and works better in more browsers than with image tags. This is a case where it really depends. If the background image in your hero is just sort of texture, if it's just decorational, then there may be no need to add an alt text equivalent. But if it is something that a blind user should know that is there, then you may be able to use like a span with role image and an ARIA label that would represent the alt text. But again, that's kind of in the weeds from what we were discussing today. But if you just wanted to know how that would normally be resolved, that's kind of a basic way that we would do that as developers.
All right, great.
All right. So the third common issues we'll be looking at is 3.3.1, clear error identification. So the guideline states that if an input error is automatically detected, the item that is in error should be identified, and that error should be described to the user in text. Having the error clearly identified and described benefit users who are blind or colorblind so that they could perceive the fact that an error did occur. It also helps people with cognitive, language, and learning disabilities who may have difficulty understanding the meaning represented by just simple icons or other visual cues than text. So for this exercise, we will try to submit a form without filling any required content and see if the errors are clearly identified and the error message makes sense. And then here's a recording when we're using Facebook sign-up form as an example. And as you see here, as soon as I leave a field blank, there's a clear indication of something is wrong. And if I try to submit it, all the error fields are clearly outlined, and then there's associated text error message explaining what has gone wrong or how could I remedy the situation. And it's visually and also cognitively clear to the user how to address those issues. So now for the hands-on portion, find a form on your site that you like to test. You could use Facebook if you couldn't find one or just want to kind of follow the same example. And try to submit a form, leave the required fields blank, or you could also try enter information in incorrect formats and see if that input will be taken, or if you receive any errors explaining why certain inputs aren't accepted. And then try to submit the form. Basically, try to break the form and enter weird information and see if the form is robust enough to detect those errors and also tell you how to address those errors. So we'll give you guys some time here to try the forms on your own. All right. Yeah, I think this should be a pretty straightforward one. And I think a lot of people do a good job in providing clear error messages. But if you notice something is missing, oh, perfect. Yeah.
Does you have a recommended web form services or vendor that do a good job with this? They currently use Wufoo, W-U-F-O-O.
Yeah, so most of the forms and form information that we're collecting on the sites that Adage works on, they're often too complex and too specific to use with things like that. We're usually looking into PIs, so we don't generally use outside form services like that. We're generally writing the forms ourselves with HTML. So I don't know specifically about outside form vendors, but I've heard of Wufoo. I think it's probably does the job. A lot of these more established form plugin systems have definitely gone through this and taken it into account with their error messaging. But if you're setting it up yourself, you just need to make sure that you have configured the fields to have validation that is specific enough to catch those issues. And just make sure that your error messages are very clear.
Awesome, thanks. We have one more question for this portion. Is there a form with or if there is a form with reCAPTCHA, how does that work and are there issues with it?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. There are a lot of accessibility issues with reCAPTCHA, especially the older versions of reCAPTCHA where you have to, you know, click all the images with a boat in them or something. That's obviously going to be very difficult for many users to do, whether they can't see the images or if they have low vision or if they have cognitive impairments that they may not be able to understand what the task is. You know, there's a lot of reasons why those are problematic. The newer versions of reCAPTCHA where you just click the checkbox, those are definitely much better to use. I think it's reCAPTCHA v3, and those do a lot of work behind the scenes rather than putting the effort on the user. So they're running scripts to kind of try and determine if the user is a bot, and working based on that. So if you have a choice, I would go with the newer reCAPTCHA, but there are people who have done much more thorough accessibility studies on reCAPTCHA out there if you look.
All right, thanks.
Okay, so the fourth demo we're going to go through, two different rules here. So we have 2.1.1, which is keyboard support, and 2.4.7, which is visible focus states. All right, so robust keyboard functionality only happens when many other aspects of a site are set up correctly. Good keyboard support benefits blind or low vision users, people with physical or mobility limitations, people who prefer to navigate by a keyboard, and any users who are filling out a form. And some helpful tips for keyboard support. One is using correct semantic HTML elements does most of the work. And good markup leads to good keyboard support. Test your site regularly. Remember the canary in the coal mine approach here. And don't remove the browser's default blue outline for focused elements unless you're replacing it with a better, more visible focus state. And if you're new to navigating via keyboard, the main mechanism you'll be using is the tab key. So just keep hitting tab to progress between interactive elements on the page. And if you need to go back to the previous interactive element, hold shift before hitting tab. And you can hit enter or sometimes spacebar to trigger a link or interactive element. So for this demo, we'll try and navigate a site two ways, by a mouse and keyboard. So from the home page, we'll click a link to another page, which we'll refer to as page A. And then we'll click another link on page A, and we'll refer to that resulting page as page B. So first we're going to show a couple of videos here. So this is an example using the American Airlines site. And we're just navigating via mouse right now. We're going through a link in the main navigation. So page A would be this travel experience page. And from here, we'll click the link to the business class page, and that will be our page B. So if we move on to the next, here's the same example using the site with a keyboard. So if we're going back to the home page, and this is a great example because you can see where the focus is. You can see here right now, these are hidden links that are showing up. They say skip to global navigation, skip to content, and skip to footer. So these are additional triggers that are specifically created to make keyboard users' navigation easier. So on this site, I'm able to trigger the navigation panel here with enter, make it back to page A with tabbing through it. And then I use here the skip to content link to get to the page content without having to go through the main navigation again. And I'm able to see which element is focused the whole time. I never get lost, and now I'm able to get back to page B. And so here's a not so good example. So on HBO Max, I'm not really doing the activity here. I'm just sort of gonna tab through the site. Is the video playing? Oh, here we go. Yeah, so I have the virtual keyboard up here to help visualize what's happening. So when the tab key flashes blue, I'm hitting tab, and when shift is highlighted, I'm tabbing backwards. And as I tab through the page, you can see somewhere in the header section, I get lost. I'm not able to see which element is focused, and I keep plowing through to see where I end up. And sometimes the focus outline returns and disappears on certain elements. And near the bottom, there's this list of clickable triggers under the heading, still have questions, we have answers. And these are completely skipped using a keyboard. I'm just going to the link above it and the link below it. And you can see I try and keep going backwards and forwards through it, keep passing over it. So there would be no way for a keyboard user to access the information hidden in those panels, which is, you know, pretty bad user experience. So on your own site, from the home page, click a link to page A, either through a link in your main navigation or on the page. And then from the second page, click another link to your page B. So then use the browser back button to get back to your home page, and then try it again, only using your keyboard. So as a reminder, use the tab key to go to the next focusable element, shift and tab to go back to the previous focusable element, and enter to trigger a button or a link. We'll give you some time to try this out. So I see a question, what were those 2 hidden links that the AA site had? Are those a good idea to have? So I didn't have enough time to really get into it while the video is playing, but those are called skip links. They're a really good idea to have. A lot of sites are using them these days. So if you think about a main navigation, it could have a whole lot of links in there, or a whole lot of you know, utility links, maybe a login link, all of your categories. So if someone is navigating by a keyboard, if they're going page to page to page, they just want to get to the content on that page faster. They don't want to have to go tabbing through the main navigation on every page that they navigate to. So those skip links just give them an easy way to skip straight down to the page. And those are usually just anchor links to on-page IDs, and they just link down to a spot past the main navigation. So they're a really great tool to have, and they're usually hidden unless they're focused. So only keyboard users will see them. There's no way to hover over them because they're hidden until you tab them. So they're very useful. I see a question, my site doesn't appear to have the focus feature when I use tab. How can I ensure this is added for people tabbing through? So one thing I do want to note, if you are using Safari on a Mac, there's another step you need to take to support keyboard navigation. I'm not a Mac user. I don't remember exactly how you do it. I think there's some setting that you have to turn on to enable keyboard navigation. But if that is not the case, then if you can't see your focus outline, then that's a styling issue. You know, that's something where you know, that would be a WCAG failure, that your focus state isn't visible. So to wrap up here, when you tried this on your site, how did it go? Were you always able to see which element was focused? And were you able to make it back to page A or page B? And was there any page functionality that you could not trigger? And all right, that covers all 4 of these common issues. And as a reminder, the topics we covered are low contrast, missing alt text for images, confusing digital forms, and inaccessibility to keyboard users.
Question, are there screen reader plugins that you can get? Any recommendations?
Yeah, so absolutely. If you're on a Mac, there's VoiceOver that is free and comes with Mac. on Windows, NVDA is free for Windows users. JAWS is also very popular in Windows, but it is pretty expensive to get a license. So NVDA is going to be the best one to get.
Great. There was another question that came in about resources, but I know you're going to show those here in a second.
Yeah, so here's a list of additional resources here. So the first one here is Google's Web Fundamentals Guide to Accessibility. This is an excellent resource. I highly recommend it. It really breaks things down. And then the Udacity free web accessibility course, which is the same information as the Web Fundamentals Guide. It's just presented as more of a web course format with videos. And there's a link here to the WCAG guidelines themselves. And then another link to Understanding WCAG 2.1, because the actual WCAG guidelines are pretty dry. So it's really helpful to have another resource that really kind of explains them a little bit more clearly for the average person. And then there's also a blog post that I did a year or two ago that is 5 website accessibility tips for CMS editors. So that's on our Adage blog. Oh, and that's NVDA as the screen reader for Windows. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Am I being too redundant if I have an event listing where I link the image, adjacent heading, and button to the same place? So that is a very good question. That is getting a little bit into the more subjective weeds about like best practices and kind of how to approach those scenarios. I'd say it's not inherently incorrect to do it that way, as long as the alt text for the image describes the location it's going to. However, I would suggest it could probably be refactored to use one link. Some advice I've been given in an accessibility audit is also that you can turn the tab index to -1 for those first 2 links and only leave the clear call to action to be tabbable, just so that someone isn't tabbing through 3 different things in a row that are all going the same place. So that's definitely a more tricky scenario to go through. There's a lot of different examples out there of how to handle it.
You see these other ones coming in too.
Yeah. So the description of alt text mentioned something about links. Was the tip Jess mentioned about images that are also links and describing where the link goes, or something else? Yeah. So if you have an anchor tag or a hyperlink and the only content of that link is an image, then that image's alt text must describe where the link goes. So if you have a link that's like read the article, something like that has a clear message, that should also be the alt text for that image. This is obviously not ideal because it does take over what would be the alt text for the image. So it's recommended that if you're linking an image, that you also have actual text nearby to handle that. Yeah, this is where things get interesting with development and accessibility. Yeah, another question. I feel like if we did everything possible to provide AAA level accessibility, the general UX would decline for those without accessibility issues. Thoughts or comments? Okay, so AAA accessibility level is not usually recommended generally, because it is quite strict. There's a lot of very kind of extreme things you have to do in certain scenarios, especially with multimedia, where it does require a lot of effort. So generally, AA accessibility is going to be the most recommended level to meet. And I don't know, Riju, what are your thoughts here? I think it's definitely possible to meet AA accessibility and still have a beautiful UX and very usable website.
Yeah, Jess, I would agree with that, and I think just to the some of the earlier point that we've made, making a site at a AA accessible standard would benefit users, and a lot of these accessibility needs are actually also closely aligned with usability best practices as well. So in general, from a user experience standpoint, a more usable and accessible site certainly provides a better user experience overall, whether it's completing a transaction, purchasing a membership or making a donation, or simply searching and looking for information. I think there's certainly ways to not. I think it's more considering all these requirements as a whole versus just focusing on the bare minimum, the of what's required in a AA standard. And I think looking at some of the accessible site that Adage worked on, in my opinion, I think they are still very stunning and very usable, very user friendly, and that abides by the brand's guideline, and still were able to provide a very engaging browsing experience for people without accessibility needs. So I think there's certainly a lot to work with the whether it's your internal design development team or your partner outside vendors to start thinking and strategize how we could merge all these requirements together, because I think it is a challenge, but when viewed, when it comes to Adage, we take that challenge as an opportunity to see how we can make the site both accessible and beautiful and intuitive and user friendly.
Thanks. Two more questions here. Go ahead.
All right, one question is, does Google Analytics provide info on users browsing your site with disability features turned on? So there's a very clear answer to this, and the answer is no. And the reason for that is for privacy. There's a lot of issues concerning privacy of users and a lot of laws against collecting certain information. There's also, there's probably never going to be a way to detect whether a user is using, say, a screen reader as they're browsing a site, and that's something that people who use assistive technology want, because if a site was able to detect that, then there's nothing stopping a site from providing them a subpar experience or trying to make their main site avoid tackling those issues and then serve them something that is less high quality. So there's a lot of reasons for this, but the answer is no. So when we're thinking about how to determine how many users use these features or use assistive technology, what we're really looking at is surveys and places like WebAIM that do large scale surveys of users and ask them questions like, how often do you use a screen reader? How do you navigate via screen reader? Those kinds of things, and that's how we learn a lot of the information that determines how we tackle these issues. Another question: how important are text scripts to accompany video on a website? So there's a large section of the WCAG that is devoted to video. They're recommended. There's I think AA accessibility requires subtitles for videos. I think AAA requires transcripts as well, if you want to meet the AAA level there. And transcripts are going to be the only way that a user who is both deaf and blind can understand what's happening in a video. So transcripts are highly recommended for that section of users. What I said earlier about AAA accessibility, usually if a site is recommended to meet AAA level, it'll only be for certain rules, and it'll only be like if that website has an audience that includes certain users. So if it was a website for the National Association for the Blind or something, then they might require that the site meet AAA levels for certain rules that have to do with screen readers and with accommodating blind users. So just to make that clear, it's not that AAA level is never used, it's just that it's deployed very specifically.
Thanks a lot again for joining us today.